This week on The Futurists, Monika Bielskyte.
If we want to make future better, it will take many of us, and it will take us to acknowledge that interdependence between us as humans, between us and all of the systems of life. And I think Ubuntu is very anchored in that. And so naturally, Protopian Futures design and thinking is very anchored in that.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and with me this week is my friend and co-host, Brett King. Hey, Brett, welcome to the show. Oh gosh, Brett's in a hotel someplace in the middle of nowhere. Hey man, where are you?
No, I'm here. I'm in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Baku, of course. A common destination. I'm not surprised. Are you
a lot of people who I say I'm in Azerbaijan. I've had at least 3 people say, yeah, I've got no idea where that is.
I know people who visited, so it's not that obscure of a place. Now that everybody has gone everywhere in the world, they're all looking for new places to explore and adventure. How are you liking it? Is it going well?
Well, I've only been here for a few hours. I'm heading out for dinner after this recording, so I'll see a bit more of the town then. But so far, it's impressive. Yeah,
great. Well, this week we have a good guest. We have been on this show. One of the themes that keeps coming up again and again is how easy it is to create a dystopian forecast. It's almost like a reflex people have because the future is different and the change is scary. And so it seems like the trap that a lot of people tend to fall into is forecasting a dystopian future. And our guest this week is focused on exercising a different set of muscles, actively envisioning a positive future scenario. So, hey, Brett, join me in giving a warm welcome to Monika. Monika, hi.
Hey, Monika.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all today.
It's good to see you. Where are you coming to us from? Where are you at now?
I am currently at home in Johannesburg, South Africa, but I'm actually going to Kazakhstan next week. So we will nearly not overlap in Central Asia.
And so the Central Asian place is the place to go.
Yeah.
Monika, what brought you to South Africa? I noticed you've been working with the African-centric design group. Tell me a bit about them.
So I've traveled extensively, about 100 countries now and counting. I was born behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. And so my parents and grandparents didn't have the luxury to leave the place that they were assigned to. And so as soon as I got my passport, I felt like I have to live out my ancestors' wildest dreams and really do it for them. And so I never really stopped traveling. But my early 20s was between Paris and Asia. My late 20s was between Americas. And then I realized that as a futurist, I work on the future. And there's a whole massive continent of which I only knew the northern part. And so I was very actively seeking out opportunities to get to know more what's happening future-wise on the African continent. And my journey began with South Africa and kind of didn't end here. I went to many other parts and places, but increasingly South Africa started feeling like home after over a decade of nomadic traveling pretty much everywhere around the world. So this is the grounding spot right now.
You and I actually met in Istanbul like 2 weeks ago. So you do get around.
Definitely. Well, this is something that I'm trying to reconcile right now because my work is taking me all around the world, but I'm trying to set some roots in Johannesburg in South Africa. So it'd be great to not be absent from here as much as possible. And that's the reason why I recently joined this amazing new project by 2 brilliant South African women called African Life-Centric Design, alongside my main project, Protopian Futures. And so we see where it goes from here.
Very nice. Is there a unique approach that's rooted in African history and culture, or is there something that's particularly relevant to Africa that you're working
on? For sure. I mean, so much of my work is very much grounded in the future insights coming from the global South, from the previously colonized world, of which, paradoxically, differently than what many people conceive of, the place that I'm actually from, which is Lithuania. My ethnic background spans two opposite corners of Eurasian continent, but I was born and raised in Lithuania, even if when I was born, it was taken off the map. And there are many really interesting parallels and obviously differences. Soviet Union collapsed in 91, apartheid regime collapsed in 94. There's so much of similarity in the shared generational trauma in trying to choose a different future than the past has been, at the same time reckoning with the complexities of that historical trauma. And so this is something that similarity and also the differences in the history and in the future, possible future solutions, is something that was really relevant to me and really insightful. And I think the principle that has been really, really influential for myself and all of my work and Protopia is South African principle of Ubuntu, which is a Nguni Bantu term, kind of in the grand sense meaning humanity, but it really sort of embodies this notion that I am because we all are. And so this idea of interconnectedness of everything, which again also connects with quite a bit of Asian understanding.
Eastern philosophy, yeah.
Eastern
philosophy. Like the word
idea.
yoga actually means union. Right, it's actually like yog. It was like it's like this, like the energy that connects everything. So it's like in Eastern philosophy for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of really fruitful discussions with a friend and colleague of mine, Viti Shilus, who's a professor of philosophy in Vilnius University, but studied and worked as a professor in China for a long time. And so what we've been discussing is how do we shape the future? In the Western context is this very individualistic idea, which also is very much anchored in the superhero story narrative, and even this idea of the Ubermensch, somebody with these superpowers that are going to come and change the day. But in the East, it's not at all how it's being considered, and not at all on the African continent. So this idea of the field of agency is much more, I think, close to reality and how future gets to be shaped. Of course, one individual person can make future much worse, as we have seen with a lot of recent geopolitical events. But if we want to make future better, it will take many of us, and it will take us to acknowledge that interdependence between us as humans, between us and all of the systems of life. And I think Ubuntu is very anchored in that. And so naturally, Protopian futures design and thinking is very anchored in that.
That's a good explanation. That helps. So that is a very Ubuntu approach to the future. I like that idea, the collectivist approach, or the idea that it touches everybody. How does that get expressed, like concretely in your work? Africa is a nation with tremendous potential and incredible wealth in terms of population, but it's also a continent that requires a lot. The needs are great. When you look around Africa, do you see opportunity and do you see a positive future, or do you see a tremendous number of challenges? How do you see it?
I would say both. So, people are always very surprised why I'm based in South Africa. They always say, oh, it'd be so much better for your career to be in the US. And having worked extensively, both in Hollywood and Silicon Valley, I do know I would, maybe fast track a lot of aspects of my career by being based.
Futures are a dime a dozen in California, though.
Well, exactly. So, I am regularly in the US. I'm regularly in other sort of major metropolises of the world. But I think the quality of the work and understanding the real scope of the futures of the world, when you are just positioned in the global north, actually suffers. And so what's interesting for me here is...
Because the South is the future. Look at demographically, there's no growth in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's not futuristic in that respect. All the growth is coming from the South, and a huge percentage is coming from Africa.
We've had this conversation a few times, Rob, about the whole concept of growth and how that's going to have to change. I think, Yeah, it's great to think about economic growth in Africa and having more affluence come in there and new infrastructure and so forth. But like we shouldn't need growth as an excuse to do that, right? We should be lifting all humanity up. I agree with Monika on that. This was part of the theme behind my last book as well.
Yeah, that's true. In practice, hard to do.
I know, but that's not what this like. Look at what's happening in Florida right now with the hurricane and stuff, and you're still going to have people that are in denial of the whole climate change thing when it's actively doing billions of dollars of damage. As we speak. It's
well, there's that.
It's
and that's a byproduct of a lifestyle. That's a byproduct of a consumer lifestyle choice that we collectively.
It is.
Humanity made that decision 50 years ago, and now we're living with the consequences.
So, Monika, how do we get that more collective appreciation as a species? How do we, educate people that actually we're much better off collaborating together and working together as a species for the benefit of all, individuals, than this sort of competitive landscape that we've created today, which tends to set us against each other?
I believe future is not just about material reality. Material reality is a big part of that, but it's also about our attitude, right? It's about our inspiration. It's about our vision. It's about our emotional engagement with whatever that is a question at hand. And so, as much as there are many issues, inequality, climate impact, we had huge issues, for example, with electricity grid here. Yet at the same time, the attitude towards the future, despite all of these challenges, is so much more inspired and so much more positive here on the continent than pretty much anywhere else in the global north, and especially in places like Europe. So I think there's the paradox of that. And, people often ask me, are you optimistic about the future? Because Protopia seems to be this very, proactive prototyping of radically imaginative and hopeful future visions that at the same time acknowledges the reality of the challenges that we are dealing with. And I always say that the way I look at the future of humanity is how you would look if you were diagnosed with a really serious, maybe not terminal, but a very, very serious form of cancer. So if you choose life, if you want to live, you have to acknowledge the reality of your diagnosis. You have to seek out the best available medical treatment, the best technological and scientific solutions. You have to address the lifestyle changes that are necessary, because maybe the lifestyle that you had before is what led to this diagnosis. But then last and not least, the mental, psychological, emotional health and your addressing of the trauma and the stress is something that can be a make or break. You can have the best available medical treatment, you can make all of the lifestyle changes, but if you don't reckon with that emotional part and how you see your future, and you don't make that very conscious choice for life, no matter how dire your diagnosis is, you're not going to live. You're very, very unlikely to live. And I think this is very much how I see the future of humanity. And this is very much how I see Protopia as a project. It is really meant to reckon and address the challenges that we face. Yet at the same time, really embrace life and all of the possibilities and not give up and give in before we actually really have no other choice but to give up and give in, right? So until that very, very last moment, I think we have to keep trying. And so that's really my approach. And I think in that, what Global South offers and what African continent offers, especially, besides this diversity of perspectives and cultural insights, because Africa is not a country, it's a continent. Johannesburg is one of the most diverse cities ethnically in the world. But you also have to be really rigorous. If Google or Apple have billions in a bank and they can just be throwing the money around, seeing what project, which startup sticks. Here, you have to really think, is this solving a real problem? Is this really addressing a real need? So you have to be very conscious of where you direct the resources, the energy, and the talent.
Okay, thanks. The thing I want to do now is link what you said to the futurist planning process. So one of the things you mentioned is that if you're diagnosed with a life-threatening condition, you have to be real. You have to start with really confronting the situation and coming to grips. And we know that many people have an inability to do that, right? There's a resistance, a denial. There's a process that's well understood by psychologists that takes people time to come to grips with that diagnosis. I think you could broaden out to humanity and say that humanity has had maybe a varying reaction to the diagnosis that we have. Brett was just talking about global climate change and the weather impacts of that. And there's still many people who are in denial about that. So one of the parts of your project that I'm
So
interested
it's like being told that you have cancer and saying, I don't believe you.
Exactly.
To the doctor.
People
Right.
do that. We see that happen.
Yeah.
If they keep smoking, if they don't change their lifestyles, right? So one of the things you do, Monika, that I'm interested in is that you're interested in the Protopian vision as an alternative to or in opposition to misinformation. Can you talk a little bit about that? Tell us a little bit about disinformation campaigns and the prevalence of misinformation in digital media and how that's an impediment to accepting the reality of the situation we are in.
So my journey as a futurist actually started by getting involved with the third wave of virtual reality technology, and through with spatial computing, and really the future of production and consumption of information and all the technology surrounding that. And from my earliest days, when people were just speaking about how VR is going to be the ultimate empathy machine and how that's going to make us all sort of so connected and compassionate of each other, I immediately have thought not just of the positive use cases, but also about all the ways that these technologies could be abused. And naturally, my thought process was very similar when we started sort of deploying the first versions of LLMs and generative AI. So what we are witnessing today in the information sphere is it being awash with narratives contradicting each other is something that seems very new to people, but actually is not. As I mentioned, I was born in the Soviet Union. I was born within a family where we had these conversations of how Russia for decades and actually more than a century have been conducting these campaigns of disinformation to around the sort of, the tagline of it really is nothing is true and everything is possible. And so what you do is you target different groups with contradicting bits of disinformation. And again, it's not misinformation, it is disinformation because it is intended to disinform. It is not accidentally misinforming people. It is the goal.
It's done with purpose. Yeah.
Exactly.
But as you're pointing out, it's not necessarily like positing a false narrative. It's just spraying disinformation.
It's a method of information manipulation and control. Yeah.
So it creates doubt, right? The idea is not necessarily to persuade people.
Hey, let's just we've got to go to break, Monika. But before we do that, we like to do sort of this quick to find out a little bit more about you as a futurist. Ask you a few quick fire questions, and then let's continue the conversation of how we create this sort of global culture of awareness and understanding, and sort of more consensus building. I think that'd be great to sort of take on the second half. But here's the lightning round. So, Monika, what was the first science fiction or futurism type stuff that you remember being exposed to in TV or literature?
I think the first influential thing that made me want to do what I do was Original Ghost in a Shell by Mamoru Oshii. And for most people, it is the 95 version. And for me, it was really the 2004 version, Ghost in a Shell Innocence, because of its truly extraordinary rich world building and world design. And
Interesting.
it is a futuristic vision that combines so many different cultural references and that feels so immersive that even it being animated, it already felt like VR. You know, when I was watching it,
Yeah.
I wanted to find myself in the middle of that world that Mamoru Oshii has created. And so naturally, the first
We're
time.
getting close to that, right? We're getting close to being able to live in these sort of VR worlds, you know, like just if you see with the way AI is creating, you know, anime versions of ourselves and things. But anyway, let's continue. What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
What is not seen as technology is storytelling and story world design. You know, I think fundamentally that is a technology, even if, you know, it is only now being delivered through fancy computational devices, becoming increasingly immersive to a point where you can't almost distinguish it from reality. This is where we're going with spatial computing. But it all started with the earliest versions of stories at the fire, especially
Right.
with medicinal plants that brought people into alternative vision of reality. And there is that argument that you know, as much as other animals, you could say that they are planning for the future, like squirrels putting away the nuts and stuff like that. What makes us really quite distinct as a species is just how much of a long-term vision we are able to have beyond just our own generation. And so I think storytelling as a technology and where future of computation is taking us with that, I think that's my choice.
Okay. Is there a futurist or entrepreneur that has influenced you particularly?
I mostly read nonfiction, science, tech, geopolitics. But if we talk about, you know, something that really kind of clicked something in my brain, I think it was maybe Audrey Tang's poem, where they were speaking of how we need to, when we think about Internet of Things, let's talk about Internet of Beings. When we talk about machine learning, let's talk about collaborative learning. When we hear singularity is near, let us remember plurality is here. And I think I came about that in the very early stages of my research as a futurist. And it really resonated and affected my trajectory in quite a significant way.
Very cool. Very interesting. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, you're listening to The Futurist with Brett King and myself, Rob Tursik, and today we have Monika Bielskyte, who is a futurist who's focused on Protopian future scenarios, and she works all over the world. In the first half of the show, she's been talking to us about her perspectives from visiting more than 100 countries and her work now on the African continent, and she's based in Johannesburg, South Africa. So, Monika, how frequently are you traveling around the world still? Is that still a part of your daily tempo? Is that still part of your life? Or are you more or less rooted now in Johannesburg?
Unfortunately, I travel way too often. I
That's a
try
long
to
trip.
cut it down for environmental reasons, but I'm traveling most of the time.
And when you work with clients, what kinds of things do you do with companies? Because you've worked with a range of businesses, from consumer products and fashion companies to big consultancies like McKinsey and movie studios like DreamWorks and Universal. What kinds of work do you do for them?
So my bread and butter is really media and tech industry. More recently, I've also worked with cities, countries, governments, and once in a while, I work with also lifestyle companies such as Nike. I do public speaking. I do a lot of academic lecturing. I do future strategy and consulting, working with R&D teams, as well as sometimes, getting invited by intermediary companies such as McKinsey to host workshops and future prototyping for their clients.
Very cool.
Oh, cool.
And the outcome there is protopian, right? You're trying to help them figure out a positive outcome or a positive scenario, I assume.
Definitely. So the goal is always to think realistically within the economic and geopolitical reality. So, and that's a really big difference between protopian and utopian approach. Utopian approach imagines that, perfect imaginary future that generally tends to not be possible. Protopian futuring reckons with the complexity of what we have in hand, and yet at the same time tries to move away from the short-term thinking that generally leads to dystopian reality, and think how we do not have to sacrifice commercial success, but sometimes we need to reposition more towards our long-term goals and longer-term vision, rather than allowing for our short-term goals to undermine sometimes the very possibility of the future for a particular company, industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we think realistically, address the challenges at hand, while still centering inclusive approach? And in that, for me, what's really crucial is the leadership of the most impacted. So always bringing forth the expertise and the perspectives of those that are at the bleeding edge of harm of any particular innovation, be it technological, design, policy, architectural, et cetera, because it's only people that are living at the bleeding edge of harm that have a visceral understanding of
that want a change to happen, right? Yeah. This is the core problem. Is like, if you think about the whole capitalist system, and one of the first questions that get asked when there's issues like refugees, or the Syrian conflict, or eco refugees, or food scarcity or whatever, is like, who's going to pay for that? And we're always, when it comes to doing the right thing for society, so I'm intrigued, like, how do organizations like McKinsey and so forth cope with the fact that you're suggesting something that sort of flies in the face of sort of capitalism and corporatism, in terms of growth economics and things like that?
Yeah, so when I started my career in this field about 12 years ago, a lot of the times I was being criticized as a naysayer, as somebody that is coming with this negative energy. But I think so many of my predictions have come to be. And so my track record, and that's, the only way you can judge a futurist is actually by their track record, how accurate your predictions have been. And mine have been quite on the spots. Whereas a lot of my colleagues that were, technology is going to save everything, have been a bit more misguided in some of their predictions. So, obviously, 12 years being in this field, becoming much more established, much more visible, but also some things having fundamentally changed, especially through the pandemic. I think the demand for much more critical thinking, and instead of just evangelizing for whatever is the newest tech hype cycle, but actually helping the organizations, be it, corporate entities or sometimes even governments, see how to render themselves more resilient, how to not fall into the trap holes of hype, has become a skill that finally they're starting to seek out much more actively and are willing to pay for. Whereas before, they only wanted to pay for something that makes them feel good and comfy about the future. And I think the pandemic was this kind of cold shower that made many of the organizations realize that resilience to what seems like chaos, but actually is not chaos, is just complex interaction of technological innovation, geopolitical disruptions, social issues. To become resilient and aware and to plan better for that is actually more important than just jump on whatever random hype that is being pushed by the VCs.
But this is not human nature, right? Human nature is we wait till the system collapses and then we finally have to do something about it. We've known about climate change for 50 years, right? That's the point, is how do we get people to look at resilience as something that's important. Like, even if you look at the cost of Superstorm Sandy in New York, right? The reported cost of putting seawalls up around the bottom half of Manhattan, the lower half of Manhattan, which is most prone risk, is going to be about 40 billion, right? And they can't get that passed. And yet Superstorm Sandy was $90 billion of damage, right? So it's like, it doesn't make sense not to have resilient infrastructure in this period of more extreme weather events and so forth. But we just can't get consensus to spend the money. I mean, I'm making a statement more than a question, Monika, but
I'll give you an even better example right now. We're living through a transition moment where in almost every industry, artificial intelligence is being deployed. In some companies, it's very early. In some companies, it's relatively advanced, but it's being deployed in many industries simultaneously, which is kind of rare for the dissemination of technology. Usually it's deployed in one industry at a time. This time it's across all different industries simultaneously. And you're seeing a range of reactions. Here in the United States, we're seeing resistance, and the resistance is coming from laborers, and particularly labor unions that feel like they're going to be displaced. And there's a lot
the dock workers, yeah.
I mean, yeah, exactly. So it's not just the motion picture screenwriters and the animators who strike, but also the dock workers who are resisting automation. At the same time, any economist will tell you that the key to raising wages is to increase productivity, and automation is a way to increase productivity. That would be an investment that would lead to greater worker productivity. That creates the pool of profit that makes it possible for wages to increase. If you don't have an increase in productivity, all you're doing is basically stirring inflation. You're spurring inflation by giving out wage increases that aren't justified or substantially based in productivity growth. So we have this challenge right now. This is a standoff, and this is a giant political issue in the United States right now, is a fear of automation and the fear of displacement. On the one hand, you have people who feel like they're going to lose something, and they're going to have to go through a painful transition. They don't want to go through that. It's understandable. It's human nature. On the other hand, economically, it's quite obvious that this is necessary. Certainly speaking for the motion picture business, if we don't find a way to automate and get more efficient, the industry doesn't make economic sense anymore. Like, the costs are way too high. But that could also be said for the ports. Our U.S. ports are among the least automated ports in the world, and they're also among the least efficient ports in the world. We tend to think of the United States as a leader in efficiency, but that's not true when it comes to shipping. So these are places that definitely need that productivity boost, but that's where the resistance is fiercest. Brett, your point about, like, we always wait till there's a crisis before we change. It's because of this, because some group that has political leverage is going to do its best.
Has resisting because they want the status quo. I mean, that's what's happening right now with, like, you look at inequality around the world, you look at the problem of not responding to climate, all of that is this, well, let me look after my tribe. We're making money out of this, so let's not change the system. Let's keep it going for as long as possible. It's frustrating.
Like, humanity produces enough food to feed the world, but we don't distribute it properly. So we throw food away. It's obscene.
Let's talk about a protopian future, Monika. Let's talk about
what you guys said.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So I think a lot of the stuff that you mentioned is a big problem of a narrative. When we talk, for example, about the issues of climate change, we need to save the planet. We need to do all this stuff for the planet. It always is not a me issue. It is a them. It is the other issue, be it the other groups of people or be it the planet. If we actually understood how codependent our own physical health is with the planetary health,
exactly.
If that was communicated much more effectively and efficiently, we would, I think, stop seeing it as a they problem. Similarly, as I mentioned before, a lot of my current work is focused on inclusivity of disabilities and neurodivergence. And whenever I try to make people think of it not as a them issue, I say, well, the reality of cancer statistics is that 1 in 2 people will go through a cancer journey in a lifetime. And 100% of us will go through a cancer journey of our loved one. Now, when we're going to find ourselves in that moment, we will be the most vulnerable. It'll be a little bit too late to change the world. Though some people, extraordinarily still try to change the world when they receive such a diagnosis. But so the point with that is that to make the world more inclusive of people undergoing cancer care is not something we do for somebody else. It's not something we do for them. It's not something we do for cancer patients. We do it for the future version of our own selves. And so I think until we manage to communicate these crucial problems of where we actually need to invest, what really is futuristic, that has not been shown to be futuristic in the sci-fi movies, as our problem, as a problem of our interconnectedness, no matter how much we might dislike it, it's going to be very hard to motivate people to change. And then another huge aspect within that, when we are being preachy, when we are being didactic, when we're making it's such an unpleasant challenge, it's such a chore, and we're not making people inspired and fired up and excited to work together towards that more compelling vision of the future, it'll be very hard to organize around it. And so, for me, this is one of the very first times that I'm seeing in a political campaign, and a Kamala Harris's campaign, as again, there's still so many issues with it, but this, putting an accent onto joy, onto that positive energy, and we need so much of that when it comes to these prescient issues, to make people excited, to make people inspired, and to make people see it not as a them, the other's problem, the problem of the planet, but as our problem, as our own future that we have a stake in and that we can do something about. But the goal of disinformation campaigns, be it, oil and gas disinformation campaigns or biomedical disinformation campaigns, is exactly to stop people from doing anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is to make people disengage, and especially to make people at that reasonable space, of people that are capable of critical analytical thinking skills, that are not succumbing to the most extreme edges, to make them feel that the world is too crazy and there's nothing we can do about it. And then, of course, it becomes
that's the problem, right?
When nothing's true and anything is possible, it means you're paralyzed. You don't know how to proceed. You don't know who to trust. You don't know what decision is right. You don't have the right information to make a decision. Monika, you're interested in now taking what you've learned and what you've practiced for the last 10 years and applying it in a new area. Tell me a little bit about your new area of focus. I think you were talking about biotechnology, right? Or is it health?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my big focus right now is becoming biomedical futures, and specifically, how do we not succumb to the temptations of eugenic discourse and ableism in our understanding what is the good future. And unfortunately, so much of the futurism historically, the earliest futurists were also eugenicists. And most of utopian thinking has been mired, in all kinds of exclusions, racist exclusions, sexist exclusions, et cetera, but especially in the exclusion of disability and neurodivergence. In a way, if disabled people still exist, is it even utopia? And so all of our energy in thinking of a better future, at most, if it ever considered, disabled people or neurodivergent people, has been very much focused on the cure, on the extermination and elimination of disability. And, in many cases, of course, cancer, chronic pain, we absolutely need to work towards better cures. But as many of these conditions become something that people live with for longer and longer periods of time, what we need to think about is also what is people's life quality. And so how, by including people with, again, chronic conditions, people undergoing cancer treatments, immunocompromised people, people with chronic pain issues, chronic fatigue issues, as well as neurodivergent people, specifically those that have sensory processing issues, that have many overlaps. For example, a lot of autistic people encounter similar difficulties, sensory processing the environment, as people undergoing cancer treatment. But the cause is different. For autistic people, this would be a neurological cause. For people undergoing cancer treatment, this would be mostly due to the side effects of the treatment as well as the cancer-related pain. But the accommodations and the changes are quite similar. The funny thing about it is that, again, this is not something that would only, if we make these improvements, if we make these inclusions, if we center these voices, it's not something that would only improve lives of neurodivergent people and disabled people. It will actually would make better transportation system design, education system design, healthcare design for everybody. We know that the current experience of airports, travel, hospitals, education facilities, public facilities, it's not working for most of us. It's something that is stress-inducing. It's something that is hostile, alienating. And so, we could implement those changes if we actually focused on people that are today considered as the edge cases. And so that's a big passion of mine.
That's a very inclusive concept. And I think that's a really, it's a beautiful idea. We had legislation here in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that required all public buildings, I think all buildings, to have accommodations for people who are differently abled. And it was quite controversial when it was introduced because the argument against it was economic. Well, it's going to cost a lot. It's going to create a lot of inefficiency. We're going to have to redesign all these, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know all the arguments against it. Well, now it's here. It's been implemented. It's been around for 2 decades or more, and it's quite normal. And it's possible to do this. You can normalize a perspective that is inclusive if society decides to do it. Like, it isn't that hard. It turns out it's quite achievable. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that what you're talking about sometimes in the abstract sounds like it might be a very difficult thing to do, but if society makes up its mind, if it takes the Ubuntu approach that you were talking about a moment ago and says we're going to make this future work for everyone, and that means, yes, we'll have to redesign access ramps and buildings and so forth, then society can actually get that done. And it turns out it's not that hard to do. It's actually quite easy to conceive of and quite easy to implement. I wish they could figure out how to do that for airplanes, because I'll tell you, man, air travel right now is hostile to the traveler. And I can only imagine if you have different abilities that it would be a difficult situation. Let me ask you about your virtual reality experience, because you know a lot about immersive media. And one of the things that I've learned about immersive media is that it helps people who have chronic conditions. Sometimes it actually can be a substitute for or an enhancement to medical treatment.
So I think a very simple example that still not a lot of people know is when we created curb cuts in our cities. This was something that was initially conceived for people that were wheelchair users. What we realized when we implemented that is that it also benefited cyclists, people with strollers, people with luggage, so many more people. At the same time,
it turns out we're all affected by that, right? That's true.
At the same time, what it did, it made it much more dangerous of an experience of walking in a city for blind people, because blind people wouldn't realize and they would walk out in a street and would get run over by cars. And so at that moment, it would have been very easy to say, oh, well, it didn't work out. Let's just scrap all this innovation altogether. But instead of that, there was a simple tweak to it, which is adding this sort of texture on the curb cuts, which then still improved life for everybody else, not just wheelchair users, and also kept blind people safe. And so much of that would also be the case if we'd start expanding, because currently disability adaptations are pretty much exclusively done only for wheelchair users, blind and deaf people. I mean, that's the extent of disability adaptation, and sometimes not even that. And there are so many more disabilities that, again, many of us will experience at some point of our lives, because unless we die a sudden death, we will experience a disability or multiple overlapping disabilities. And yet almost none of that stuff is being addressed. And again,
in a way, it's we have kind of an outdated notion, right? We have almost like a binary classification of you're abled or you're disabled. But the reality, I think, is that people have different abilities, and there's a spectrum, a range of possible abilities. Some people have a concentration of abilities in one area or another area. Other people don't have that so much. And so are they disabled, or are they just differently abled? And I think that this has been a hard thing for people to come to grips with. But the reality is that every person in their life is going to go through different phases of ability. So it's also a part of the human life cycle. Like each individual is going to have moments where they're very able and moments where they're gradually going to have new disabilities or different abilities. How can you help us understand that? Like what can you do? What steps are you taking to help us envision that and maybe develop a little bit more empathy to people who have differing abilities?
Well, I think it's exactly about that. It's inviting, not making it some kind of inspiration porn or also sort of pity porn, but inviting curiosity. So over the last few years, I've become much more open about my experience with autism and ADHD. And because there's these very cliched and stereotyped understandings of especially autism, I get people respond to me saying like, oh, but you're so successful. You can't be autistic. Oh,
Right.
Monika, but you have
There's the
so many
binary,
friends.
right? You
How
can't be
could you be
successful if you're
autistic?
different. Yeah.
and oh, but you are achieving so much. But you travel. But you. And what that proved to me is that there's such a misunderstanding and such a stereotyping of most of these conditions and what people are capable or incapable of. And we know that a lot of the top innovators, scientists, technologists in the world have been people on a spectrum. So clearly, they were very capable of achieving extraordinary things.
Yeah.
But most of the time, because they belonged to a particular social class or were born into families where they could still pursue their dreams and have certain adaptations that were necessary for them to function, because you can be hyper capable. For example, in my case, my future methodology, I am a voracious reader. I have extraordinary network of people that I tap into that are smarter than me in many of the fields, to gain those specific insights. But what really binds it together is, I think, my very much autism related phenomenal pattern recognition. I can look at something that other people see as chaos and I just see emergent patterns. And people are like, how do you do it? How were you able to see that 5 years before anybody else noticed that? I'm like, I don't know. I just look at that stuff and I see a pattern where other people see chaos. And naturally, for some people, unfortunately, also some people on the spectrum, that's how people succumb to conspiracy wormholes. But you have these super abilities, yet at the same time, if you are put in different conditions, you would absolutely become disabled. If I were put in an overstimulating sensory environment with too many artificial scents, with too much blinking light, with too much noise, let's say if I had to work in the supermarket, something that seems like, oh, such a basic job, I would absolutely not be able to function. So, what that shows to you is when people are given conditions to excel, they're able to excel. Think of all the people like you and me that are wearing eyeglasses that do not even think of ourselves as disabled. Why do we not think of ourselves as disabled? Because we have access to glasses. It is normalized to wear glasses. It is cool to wear glasses. Glasses are affordable enough. And so we can see, we can type on our laptops, we can drive, and we can participate in our society. But I remember when I was a kid in the sort of post-Soviet primary school, as kids, there were no cool glasses. Kids wearing glasses were being mocked. And so some kids just wouldn't wear glasses and wouldn't be able to see what is on the teacher's board and would experience very viscerally that disability and marginalization that comes with that. So much of disability and ability is conditioned by society and the kind of adaptations we have or do not have access to. And of course, it becomes more extreme when correlated with other discriminations, racism, misogyny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're
this
missing
is your area
out.
of focus now. You're shifting your focus towards this in your practice.
I'm trying to make these things come together. So like I'm trying currently, I have these sort of three branches that are sort of entangled and sometimes apart. So one part is Protopian Futures, envisioning, prototyping, hopeful future visions that reckon with the complex issues that we're facing today, and doing that work both in the field of science fiction and future documentary in the media industry, as well as for companies and governments. The other field is the most depressing part, which is future of hybrid warfare and disinformation warfare, and how we become more resilient towards it. And that, biomedical.
That's a topic I'd like to visit with you in the future. That's an interesting subject for me.
And then the last part is everything, and how do we make better futures by having much better understanding of what inclusion of disabled and neurodivergent people offers us, as not as something, again, as charity work, but as something that would enrich our society, as something that currently so many people being excluded, so many people that are more than capable of bringing extraordinary value to society, not being able to participate in the workforce, not being able to participate in society. We are missing out on the insights, and actually it is detrimental
Agreed.
to...
Agreed. We need the range of diversity to make society work better. Well, Monika, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show this week. Thank you so very much for sharing your perspectives about Ubuntu and this empathetic approach to envisioning the future. It's a very refreshing perspective to hear. I've been curious about Protopian Futures since I first came across your work on LinkedIn. Now, tell me, where can people find you? I know you're present on LinkedIn. Are there other places where people can find out about your work? Can you tell us about that?
I am on LinkedIn. I am on Twitter /X as it's going more and more downhill, but I'm still trying to stay on there. I'm on Instagram. Protopian Futures also on Instagram and on X. And there's my link tree where I post my most recent talks, podcasts, Super. And there's a whole lot of that.
Well, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining the Futurists. Always a good conversation. We'd love to have you back. I would be very excited to talk to you more about disinformation and your experience growing up in the Soviet Union. So for the folks who are listening to the show, our guest this week has been Monika Bielskyte, and she can be found on the social media sites that we talked about a moment ago. Each week on The Futurist, we're going to bring you another person who is thinking about and designing and planning and shaping the future of their vision. And so we'll look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, I want to thank the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible. That includes our engineer, Kevin Hirschhorn, our producer, Lisbeth Severance, my co-host, Brett King, who unfortunately had to go. He's coming in from a faraway place and his internet connection was not stable this week. That happens sometimes. But he'll be back, and I'll be back again next week with another Futurist. And until then, we will see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.